Okay, shipping and climate change. This rather blurry picture is an extinction rebellion protest outside the International Maritime Organization's headquarters back in May of this year, when the International Maritime Organization was considering measures to adopt to meet its recently adopted climate change targets. More on that later. Now, shipping is rather difficult to fit in to the climate change regimes. I mean, there's good and bad things about shipping. One is it's actually probably the most efficient way of shipping goods. It's certainly better than truck, rail or air. But on the other hand, it uses a lot of very dirty fuel, produces a reasonably large amount of CO2 emissions. It's responsible for moving more than 80% of traded goods by weight, so it's a major part of the global economy for getting goods from A to B. International shipping, depending on what figures you go for, it amounts to about 2.2% of global CO2, up to 3%. And that's about the annual contribution of Germany or Brazil. It's projected to grow between 50 and 250% by 2050. That's actually rather terrifying amount, the 250% projected growth. And by 2050, it could produce as much as 17% of global emissions. Now, statistics, that could be 17%, but everybody else's global emissions has come down, so may not be quite as dramatic as that seems, but it's outside the current international framework. It's outside Kyoto. It was taken outside along with international aviation. It's outside Paris. Domestically in the UK, it's outside the UK Climate Change Act of 2008. So what's the problem? Why is shipping special? Well, here's an example this is a very good example in a paper co-authored by Kevin Anderson about shipping emissions. Which country is going to pick up the greenhouse gas emissions from international shipping? You've got a container vessel owned by a Danish company. Okay, that's one possible country. It flies a Marshall Islands flag. Another one, Marshall Islands, one of the states which are actually very at risk of disappearing due to sea level changes. Chartered by a French shipping company. The crew are from Russia and Malaysia. It loads its containers in Shanghai, in China, goes to Singapore, drops some containers off, takes some more on, then goes up to Northern Europe, and we get our iPads and everything sort of dropped off at various ports. You could probably get at least 10 different countries here. And not to say, what about the sort of places where it refuels, the ship refuels? Maybe that would be a possibility. Now, the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 includes domestic aviation and shipping emissions in national targets for developed countries. That's Article 1. But for international aviation and shipping, they're taken out, and they are left to two UN bodies to work with, the ICAO for international aviation, and what I'm going to be looking at is international shipping, and the relevant organisation of it is the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, outside whose premises Extinction Rebellion were having a rather colourful demonstration in May. Before Kyoto's protocol was adopted in 1997, there was some sort of thought given to how we could include international shipping within that framework. And they were looking at 5 options which might be used to deal with how you allocate and control emissions from the fuel used for shipping. 1, you might have no allocation. 2, you might allocate the emissions to the country where this bunker fuel is being sold. 3, you might allocate this to the country of the transporting company, and that could be the country of registration or the country of the operator. So even within that option, you're starting to get fragmentation, allocation to the country of departure or destination, and maybe we might share the emissions between them, or allocation to the country of departure or destination of the passenger or cargo. So various possibilities were considered, and it was regarded, oh my goodness, it's all too complicated. We'll leave it to the IMO to sort out for shipping and to the ICAO to sort out for aviation. And we'll see how well that has worked out in a moment. So what has the IMO actually done? Right, well, it's got some, initially its work was to have, it's amended the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan. Basically, these are guidelines for fuel consumption data. What fuel is being consumed by vessels. So they added a new regulation back in October 2016 to the relevant part of the key environmental treaty for international shipping, which is MARPOL. Annex 6 deals with air pollution from ships. That's something which came in 2005. And it's Annex 6 which we're focusing on for this exercise. So this is a reporting exercise. We're going to require collection and reporting of ship fuel oil consumption data, and we're going to have that submitted to an IMO ship fuel oil consumption database. Very much in the general sort of paradigm of controlling corporate activity, you know, sort of let's have lots of reports, let's have nice things on our websites about what we're doing, but any sort of thing about telling people what actually you need to do, actual hard regulations, and we don't want to do that. That's so old-fashioned, command and control. Yes. But there's another player in this game, the European Union. Whatever you think about Brexit or whatever, the EU is a very powerful group of countries. It's what is known as a regional economic integrated organisation, and as such it has been able to be a signatory to some international treaties in its own right. They also had a reporting regulation in 2015, and this is actually wider than the IMO's requirements. You're going to report 3 items: the actual cargo carried on board, the fuel consumed, and the CO2 emitted. Much wider than what the IMO are mandating. And these are some of the differences from the IMO scheme, this reporting scheme. First of all, IMO only requires reporting of the fuel consumed. Secondly, the regulation requires the calculations to be verified by an accredited verifier and sent to a European Commission database. The IMO says, well, we can have verification by the flagship administration, hello Panama, under national procedures. Well, you know, that's going to work pretty well, isn't it? Thirdly, now this is an important difference about transparency. The regulation, the EU regulation, says that this information is to be publicly available. We can name and shame. But the IMO says, oh, no. Oh, the raw data will be seen by the IMO alone and the flag states, and then we'll put aggregated anonymous data to the public. You know, we the public shouldn't be able to see this. The EU monitoring scheme started a little bit earlier, 1st of January 2018. The IMO scheme started 1st of Jan 2019. Now, I'm going to just talk about one aspect of pollution which doesn't directly affect climate change, but it will indicate some of the dynamic between the EU and its regulations in the maritime field and the IMO. These are the sulfur limits. These are the things which are obsessing everybody in the shipping community at the moment. Sulfur dioxide is not a good thing for human health, and there are limits which have been imposed on the amount of sulfur which you can have in your fuel. The initial limits were 3.5% and a lower limit of 0.10% for ships operating with what were called emission control areas. Parts of the North Sea are emission control areas, but it's not universal. And the The EU then, in its sulphur directive, said, right, from the 1st of January 2020, we're going to have a general cap of 0.5 within EU waters, within the EEZ of the EU. The IMO we're going to say, well, we're going to phase this global cap in of 0.5% sometime between 2020 and 2025. So there was the possibility that you would get an EU measure coming into effect for EU waters in advance of the IMO regs. Not surprisingly, perhaps, in October 2016, the IMO decided, right, we're going to effectively take the same implementation date as the EU. And that is an example of the IMO being basically given a kick up the backside by the EU and basically falling into line with what the EU has been doing. And that's significant as regards measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from maritime transport. The IMO had done nothing in this apart from this fuel reporting measure. The EU Parliament was not pleased about this, so at the end of 2017 they said, right, unless you do something by 2023, we are going to add shipping to our revised emissions trading system. Now it would be a pretty awkward fit, but we're going to do that. So what happens? April 2018, the IMO decides we've got an ambition to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from shipping by 50% over the levels in 2008 by 2050. And at the same time, we will pursue efforts to phase them out entirely. So that's a sort of... Now, it's interesting about 2008 levels. What are those 2008 levels? You remember 2008 was also the year of the credit crunch. Does that mean that we're going to have that clearly reduce the amount of trade at the end of the year, and maybe that's a lower level of emissions, which is going to be the starting point. But it still seems to me a particularly low level of ambition. They've also got a carbon intensity reduction target. That's the amount of emissions relative to each ton of cargo which is being shipped, and the target is to reduce that 40% by 2030, 70% by 2050. So we've got these targets, and the strategy also says that we are going to be following a pathway of CO2 emissions reduction consistent with the Paris Agreement temperature goals. And I think this is what possibly Extinction Rebellion were sort of upset about. Paris is not really demanding enough, but I don't see that these are particularly consistent with Paris, but it's perhaps better than nothing. So what's going to happen? What are we going to do? How are we actually going to actualize this ambition? Here we are, we're perhaps about a year and a half on from the great breakthrough in April 2018. Well, there's been quite a lot of talking going on. First of all, there's going to be some measures which will affect new ships. They're going to strengthen the energy efficiency design index for new ships as of for the future. So we're going to have tougher energy efficiency requirements of those, but those are for new ships. And there's a lot of tonnage floating around at the moment which will be used for the next 10, 15, 20 years. And then we've brought in these new measures. They're being brought in from 2025 for new ships into 2022. Container ships, we've got an increased reduction rate for larger ship sizes. So this is all very good for the future, and I'm sure it will be making a good contribution when these new ships come into play in the 2030s and 2040s. Where we will be with climate change then, I dread to think. But And then they thought, well, what about the next steps, the sort of more short-term steps? So we're going to make an inventory of current global emissions of greenhouse gases. So we're going to include the total greenhouse gas emissions from 2012 to 2018. So we're going to get statistical data on that. We're going to get estimates of carbon intensity for the worldwide fleet. And in particular, we're going to get estimates for what was the carbon intensity of international shipping for 2008, the key baseline date, which is set out in reference to that headline target of a 50% reduction from 2008 by 2050. Yes, we're going to have cooperation with ports to reduce emissions from shipping. Actually, this can be done in several ways. One is ports can get more efficient in scheduling shipping, so you don't have such long delays with ships waiting outside to go into ports. We could also have what is called cold ironing, which is basically, instead of when you're in port, running the ship off its fuel, off its own fuel, you plug it into the local grid, which hopefully will be from renewable sources, and effectively, you just plug in and get local electricity that way. So that could make a contribution. I think China is actually quite advanced in developing this system, so that's quite hopeful. There's all sorts of things which they think could be looked at. Onshore power supply, which I've mentioned. Alternative low-carbon fuels are another thing which they're suggesting. But, so they're going to have a multi-donor voluntary, note that word voluntary, multi-donor trust fund to provide a dedicated source of financial support for technical cooperation. Yeah, but what about the most obvious candidate for an immediate reduction in GHG emissions? Slow steaming. If you can steam slower, that will reduce GHG greenhouse gas emissions. The French, before the meeting, the 74th meeting of the MEPC, the Maritime and Environmental Protection Committee, the French were suggesting, well, we should have mandatory slow steaming except for container ships. But that was said, oh, well, we're going to have higher operating costs with longer voyages, and that's just going to encourage people to buy in extra shipping so that they can carry on with business as usual. And slow steaming doesn't seem to have a lot of traction at the moment. And so that's why I say I guess that's a norm. It didn't really get anywhere in the meeting in April. And indeed, when we were looking at the question of how the IMO should deal with short-term measures, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, the US objected to using the word prioritization as regards those measures. There's a sort of entrenched resistance to this. I mean, they hate the sulfur cap, which is coming in, but they've managed to be defeated on delaying its implementation, and they don't like this even more. Tweet from the Wall Street Journal after the MEPC 74 meeting. At this point, slow steaming is basically dead. The other observer at the IMO said, I think it's too soon to be definitively rule anything in or out. The discussion will continue. I don't hold out much hope for that at the moment. I'm just going to now, how am I doing for time, Tabitha? 5 minutes. Good. Some possible measures. There's a really good report by the International Transport Federation, which is part of the OECD, and they've produced a document saying how shipping could be decarbonised by 2035. And it's basically a combination of a whole lot of different measures, including slow steaming, more efficient ship design, alternative fuels, they all have some drawbacks. Some alternative fuels would require completely new ships. Others, you could retrofit existing ships, but it's going to cost. LNG has been touted as one possibility. Problem with LNG is there's methane slip, and methane is a greenhouse gas which doesn't hang around as much, but is actually much more potent. There's electric, and there's actually been a development with an autonomous ship which is going to be starting running in Norway on the purely national run, called the Yara Birkeland, which is going to be an autonomous ship, and it's going to be entirely run by battery. And one of the aims of this is to take as much freight off Norway's roads as possible and ship it onto this domestic shipping line. So that's encouraging. Biofuel, well, that could be exciting. Now, this is something which carbon offsetting. We all love carbon offsetting. How about this? From Norden's website. When burned, the fuel produces carbon dioxide. But the firms say this is offset by the fact that the fuel is made from organic material which has absorbed a similar amount of the gas at a previous stage. So we could just sort of chop trees down because they've already done their work of offsetting gas, and we can offset that. I don't know if anybody, I just found that an extraordinary statement, but it does produce less carbon dioxide than using heavy fuel oil. Sails, we could start retrofitting sails, and Renault is interested in using sails on its car carriers and is going to start putting sails on. Sails, though, will have the disadvantage of having reducing speeds to 11 knots. Most container ships are between around 20 knots, so you may have to wait longer to get your Renault car, but I think we can perhaps all live with that. There's marine geoengineering, which is basically pumping stuff into the oceans. Interestingly about that, the sulfur cap. Sulfur dioxide is also something which has an absorbent effect on CO2, so possibly the sulfur cap might be good for human health in some respects, but possibly it's removing some sort of reducing the amount of sulfur in the atmosphere is perhaps removing a sort of form of CO2 extraction. So swings and roundabouts. Yes, so these are all the other longer term measures. I have two questions. Is there a longer term or even a medium term in the climate emergency? I don't think so. That's, and another suggestion for people in the developed world, buy less stuff. And I think Oxfam has got a sort of a whole month of September devoted to that. Most of the stuff I'm wearing is either clothes I've had for a long time or this very smart jacket which I bought in a charity shop in Wells the other day. So now, what about the benefits of climate change for the maritime world? Well, we could open up the polar shipping routes, the North shipping route. I mean, apparently by 2050 we're going to be at least 60 days ice-free in the Arctic. Great. Now, what about the disadvantages of the sulfur cap? Well, one of the things I've mentioned is lack of an absorbent material in the atmosphere to get rid of CO2. But an advantage of the sulfur cap is it's going to make things really much more expensive for ship owners. If they have to go over to low sulfur fuel, it's going to be much costlier. That all the alternatives to that, like fitting closed-loop scrubbers, is going to require a lot of retrofitting. It may produce an economic stimulus to get ship owners thinking about alternative fuels, but don't hold your breath on it. There's what I'm looking for in the future. Could there be future unilateral action by the EU? Could we have a mandatory slow steaming requirement for any ship which wants to get entry to EU ports? Now, there's nothing in UNCLOS which would, the United Nations Convention on the Order of the Sea, which would prevent that. There may possibly be World Trade Organization issues which I had actually got some extra slides on that, but they got the chop because I know I'm under time constraints. Now, the last thing I'm going to do is nothing to do with shipping. It's a plug. This is a commercial. A friend of mine in Bristol does climate change talks, and she actually, her 2016 talks are up on YouTube. If you look under Nikki Jones, What is Climate Change, you will get access to those. Obviously, a lot's happened since 2016, but they're still very good. She set up a charity called Avon Needs Trees to plant trees as much as possible, and what they're aiming to do is to buy a piece of land up near Chippenham, plant trees, and the aim is that will sequester carbon from the air, enhancing biodiversity, and also give us natural flood management. This is why Avon needs trees, even though the site they want to buy is up in Chippenham, because it all sort of that works out together. And they are at the moment making they got over the first stage of their funding requirements of having ecological surveys and getting valuations of the land. They're now in the process of seeking heritage lottery funding for this, and then if they get that, then they're going to be going around sort of corporate donors, possibly saying to universities, hey, how about some carbon offsetting? So that's my plug, and I hope I haven't done too much slow steaming. Thank you.